Welcome to ARSTPLAINED, the show where I explain art. My name is Michelle and... Very interesting. I don't recall seeing this here before. Is this new to you too? Alright, if you say so. If you think you can pull a fast one on me, you'd be quite wrong, old sport.
Okay, I should have said something earlier. I just thought I could help and weigh in on what you were talking about.
You can't weasel your way out of this one, old sport.
I'm no weasel, I'm just really lonely.
Well, okay then, but you better not sit there in silence like the eccentric goofball. Welcome to ARSTPLAINED, the show where I explain art. My name is Michelle, and it's been a long time coming to get to this point in history. A long, long time. And it should have come sooner, but all I can do is march for a better tomorrow. Today, my fine friends, I will be discussing some of America's most notable and contentious equestrian statues, or statues with riders on horseback. DC has more equestrian statues than any other city in the United States. The first bronze equestrian statue in the nation debuted in front of the White House in Lafayette Square. It depicts President Andrew Jackson on a rearing horse. The piece was sculpted by Clark Mills and originally erected in 1853. On June 23, 2020, protesters attempted to topple the statue before being thwarted by law enforcement, who reportedly used pepper spray to clear the area. This occurred during a still ongoing nationwide debate over Confederate and other contentious statues, and whether they should be relocated, replaced, or removed entirely. Jackson is a particularly polarizing U.S. figure for many reasons, one of which is that he owned about 150 slaves at the time of his death, according to the Hermitage. Jackson also played a major role in the Trail of Tears, the forced mass death marches of American Indians that relocated them from their ancestral homelands. Rather than trail around the district and discuss hoof positions and other hee-hawing nonsense, let's fast forward to more recent news. News in Richmond, Virginia that was announced on June 4th. On that day, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam announced the removal of the Monument Avenue statue of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate States Army during the American Civil War. The 14-foot statue was first unveiled in 1890, standing on a towering 50-foot-tall base. It was created by French sculptor Antonin Mercier. In the registration form for the National Register of Historic Places, it reads that the design of the sculpture was intended to perpetuate the memory of Lee's character as a man of heroic action, noble in defeat. As we bid goodbye to this work, I would like to sincerely say, good riddance. But there is another depiction of Lee that still stands today that also deserves a righteous dethroning. One of the most controversial depictions of Robert E. Lee is in Charlottesville, Virginia. This 1924 bronze equestrian statue was sculpted by Henry Merwin Trady and Leo Lentelli and commissioned by philanthropist and stockbroker Paul Goodloe McIntyre. It has been considered problematic for years. In 2016, Charlottesville Vice Mayor Wes Bellamy called on the City Council to remove the statue, saying that its presence disrespected parts of the community. A year later, the council voted 3-2 to remove it, but opponents sued the city, arguing that war memorials are protected under Virginia law and are not within the power of the council to alter. Because of this, it has remained in place ever since. On August 11, 2017, this particular statue made national headlines, being a focal point in a white nationalist and neo-Nazi rally known as Unite the Right. Protesters openly showed opposition toward the potential relocation of the statue, while chanting, "Jews will not replace us." The following day, white supremacist James Alex Fields Jr. rammed his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing a 32-year-old woman named Heather Heyer and injuring 19 other people. This is the unfair price that many pay when they fight for democracy and the end of bigotry. First, there was outrage in response to this incident, and then there were new, as well as renewed, calls to action. In Baltimore, Maryland, Mayor Catherine Pugh ordered the removal of 4 Confederate memorials. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio launched a review of all symbols of hate on city property. New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu proceeded to take down 4 Confederate monuments. In a speech, he said this:
"So for those self-appointed defenders of history and the monuments, they are eerily silent on what amounts to historical malfeasance, a lie by omission. There is a difference, you see, between remembrance of history and the reverence of it."
According to a February 2019 report from the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are still roughly 1,750 Confederate monuments, roads and other place names, flags, holidays, and other symbols in public spaces across the nation. These include over 100 K-12 schools and 3 colleges, 9 observed state holidays in 5 states, and 10 U.S. military bases. Some may be surprised by the reason why there is such a large number of Confederacy-praising statues in the U.S. In an interview with NPR, Jane Daly, an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago, said, "Most of the people who were involved in erecting the monuments were not necessarily erecting a monument to the past, but were rather erecting them toward a white supremacist future. These statues, flags, and other symbols were a power play, according to Daly, that were meant to intimidate those who come to the seat of justice or the seat of the law." This graph shows the distribution and growth of Confederate iconography, most notably between 1900 and 1920, around the time when the NAACP was founded, when there was a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, and when Southern states were enacting Jim Crow laws. There was another major rise of Confederate symbols between 1954 and 1968, during the Civil Rights Movement. That sure is interesting. It's almost like the iconography is actually a response to something. But what could it be? I said, but what could it be?
Confederate monuments promote a historical narrative called the Lost Cause, which revises history to say that the Confederates were fighting not for slavery, that they were fighting for states' rights, that they were fighting to protect their homes, and in particularly that black people were better under slavery. Hopefully, I'm not the first to tell you that that is a complete crock of shit, but better to let the historical actors tell you for me. If you go to state secession documents, you will see grievance after grievance towards the North for threatening slavery, or the choice of Confederate politicians that even when the Confederacy was on its last leg and they were going to lose the war, they still would not free the enslaved people and arm them to fight in the war, because that would literally dismantle the entire reason for which they were fighting, which was white supremacy. The narrative is also disproven through the actions of the enslaved people themselves, who literally despised their enslavement so much that they risked their lives and their families to flee to the North towards freedom, despite the fact that Confederate authorities and Confederate politicians believed that they would stay. You can see the symbology of this narrative in many of the Confederate monuments and the way that they are portrayed. You can see the forlorn soldier with his head bowed, facing towards the North because the rebels never turned their back to the enemy. Or you can see it in the general god deity who's calling forth his soldiers towards a glorious cause. Or lastly, you can see it in the evocative, sometimes even religious inscriptions that make grandiose claims about the reasons why the soldiers were fighting. What this all boils down to is a massive propaganda campaign to revise the history of the Civil War so that white Southern men could justify several things: their return to power, the end of Reconstruction, the systematic terrorizing of African Americans through lynchings, jailings, and beatings, and the installation of white supremacist legislation. And the best tool to introduce this propaganda was the monuments.
You know, I appreciate the insight, but ghosts frighten me to my bone. I think we've had enough of you now. Would you mind taking leave?
Oh, are you sure? I have so much more to say.
You were not invited into my abode.
Actually, you did invite me.
Well, look what we have here. I did not hang you on the wall. You do not fit my aesthetic. This seems like a good spot. Well, enjoy it while it lasts. I have far too many tainted objects lying around. And you are just another brick in the wall.
I'll be quieter, I promise.
Do not steal the thunder, you ghoul. I did not invite you to speak, but you better not sit there in silence like the eccentric goofball. Well, I guess you led me astray, didn't you? The internet is a cold, merciless, deceitful place. Let's turn back time. In 1861, Confederate Vice President Alexander H. Stephens said in his cornerstone speech, "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." Members of the Ku Klux Klan often waved the Confederate battle flag at their rallies. And in 1963, Alabama Governor George Wallace vowed segregation forever before unfurling that very flag. Gee, I don't see anything about states' rights here. What about you? That's what I thought. Since 2015, there have been more than 100 monuments and other symbols of the Confederacy removed. Among them was the Confederate battle flag that had flown at the South Carolina State House grounds in Columbia for 54 years. And wow, oh geez, the world is still turning, but there is still more work to be done. Discussions on equestrian statues have affected the country far and wide. One example in New York has resulted in mass responses and protests that deserve some careful re-examining. The equestrian statue outside the American Museum of Natural History features Theodore Roosevelt atop a horse, flanked on either side by an American Indian and an African man, both carrying his rifles. The work was sculpted by James Earl Fraser in 1939. Fraser had a long career as one of the nation's most important sculptors. With many works featured prominently in Washington, D.C., Fraser had a long career as one of the nation's most important sculptors, such as his Alexander Hamilton sculpture, featured in front of the Treasury Building, the Arts of Peace sculptures located near the Lincoln Memorial, the Guardianship and Heritage sculptures outside the National Archives, the Contemplation of Justice and Authority of Law statues in front of the Supreme Court building, and the Second Division Memorial within President's Park on the National Mall. His most famous sculpture, though, is Wisconsin's The End of the Trail, which has come to symbolize the genocide of American Indians amid relentless westward expansion. What a portfolio indeed. But it's his Theodore Roosevelt statue that has truly kicked up a row for many. The pyramidal composition of the statue has yielded differing interpretations. Some believe it represents Roosevelt's belief in the unity of the races, while others see it as a visual hierarchy of racial authority. The lack of agreement has resulted in nearly 50 years of protesting, with the first protest occurring on June 14, 1971. At this time, 6 young American Indians were arrested and accused of defacing the memorial with several buckets of red paint. More recently, in October 2016, an organization called Decolonize This Place described the statue in an open letter as the most hated monument in New York City. A year later, on October 26, 2017, a group known as the Monument Removal Brigade splashed red paint on the base of the statue. But does Roosevelt truly deserve to be in the middle of all this commotion? It can seem pretty complex. Sinclair Devereaux Marber, a litigation associate at White & Case LLP, and the former articles editor for the Columbia Journal of Law and the Arts, wrote, "He can be seen as either a villain or a hero, depending on the lens through which impact on the American story is viewed. He was a scientist, conservationist, and eugenicist with a deep history of involvement with the American Museum of Natural History. In fact, the museum's charter was signed in the Roosevelt home in 1869. In 1872, a teenage Theodore contributed his first of many donations to the museum. During his tenure as president, he created 5 national parks and established the National Forest Service. In 1889, Roosevelt published The Winning of the West, an epic multi-volume history of the conquest of the American West. In this, he explicitly characterized the transport of African slaves to the United States as a crime. He also wrote that he saw American Indians not as an adversary, but as a ward of the state, whom it was his duty to protect. Even so, Roosevelt adhered to the theory of cultural evolution. He believed that whites were farther along on the road of human development, in part due to their subjugation of others. Edmund Morris, in his book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, further described him as no more tolerant than that of any cowboy. there has been many a discussion on the possible best solutions for the statue. Maybe add new, temporary, or permanent works to foster public dialogue and recontextualize the monument. Maybe relocate it to another city-owned public site or inside the museum itself, or perhaps remove it entirely. Despite all of this well-warranted hullabaloo, the museum has taken no efforts to relocate the statue. Instead, the institution engaged in passive contextualization, placing placards at the base of the monument, creating an exhibition in a back hallway of the first floor of the museum, and providing added information on its website. If you think this all leads to a fair, well-meaning conclusion, read the placard. It states, "Today, some see the statue as a heroic group, others as a symbol of racial hierarchy. In all honesty, they may as well have just done nothing." I will give them kudos, though, for including the following statement on their website by Mabel O. Wilson, Professor of Architecture and African American Studies at Columbia University.
Yes, I would absolutely call Theodore Roosevelt a racist. He had very specific views around which races, the Nordic, the Alpine, were going to lead Euro-American civilization forward.
Should we honestly be surprised that this institution of knowledge is unable to understand the woes that have time and time again been communicated? I mean, this is the same museum that housed the most disturbing exhibitions on record, human zoos. In 1904, Ota Benga, a Congolese man from a tribe called the Batwa, was exhibited in an empty cage here before being forced into a human zoo exhibit in 1906 at the Bronx Zoo. Certainly, we should assume that the American Museum of Natural History from the early 20th century must differ in values to the museum that we visit today. But a more effective compromise would have been to relocate the statue to the museum's interior Roosevelt Hall. Unfortunately, it's not easy relocating historical landmarks. It was on June 21st that the New York Times reported that the landmark will indeed be removed after 80 long years of its standing. In an interview, the museum's president, Ellen V. Futter, said that it was the statue's hierarchical composition that prompted the move. Mayor de Blasio said in a statement that it is the right decision and the right time to remove the problematic statue, which he said explicitly depicts Black and Indigenous people as subjugated and racially inferior. It is still unknown where the statue will go or if it will be replaced. If there is one equestrian statue in the nation that really sets a new, positive standard, it has to be Rumors of War by American artist and Barack Obama portraitist Kehinde Wiley. His first public sculpture is a moving and beautiful depiction of a young Black man with dreadlocks and modern clothing atop a muscular horse. Since December 10, 2019, Wiley's statue has been located in Richmond, Virginia, in front of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. VMFA director Alex Nurgis told Architectural Digest that the plan was to have the statue mark the 400-year anniversary of the arrival of the first slaves in America in 1619. This positioning at the Virginia Museum is also particularly perfect because Wiley's inspiration for the work was a nearby 1907 created statue of Confederate Army General James Ewell Brown Stuart. While the latter statue depicts a Confederate Army general who was involved in several conflicts with American Indians, Wiley's statue instead honors Black youth lost to the social and political battles waged throughout our nation. Wiley further told ArtNet, "Rumors of War attempts to use the language of equestrian portraiture to both embrace and subsume the fetishization of state violence." Pulitzer Prize-winning art and architecture critic Philip Kennicott was apt to emphasize on the spectacle that was organized at the bronze statue's initial unveiling in Times Square on September 27, 2019. Today, celebratory unveilings of statues are often seen as old-fashioned, but this event deserved the adulation. Not only gawking crowds, but a brass band and several political notables were there before a silver cloth was tugged off the artwork for all to see what lay beneath. The title, Rumors of War, is also worth taking inspiration from. It is a reference to a biblical passage from Matthew 24:6. "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. I agree. We have yet to fully succeed. We are still marching, and we are still fighting. Equestrian statues are more than just bronze or steel. A major part of these artworks is the location, what context the setting and culture offer.
In 2011, the Pew Research Center did a study where they asked people what was the main cause of the Civil War. 48% of people who were asked said that states' rights was the main cause of the Civil War, not slavery. 38% of people said slavery was the main cause of the Civil War. And anecdotally, we've all seen that guy with the Confederate flag across his truck saying, "Heritage, not hate," even though that flag was not commonly flown in the South until decades after the war, right about the time that the monuments went up, and then usually in the face of African Americans as they demanded equality. The geographic placement of Confederate monuments says as much about their purpose as the words, symbols, and context around their installation. Bring them down, and we will be revising history, back to a reversion that credited historians have been trying to tell us for years.
By erecting a statue, it is meant to seem immortal, and many are fooled into thinking that some statues should be. Why? Their extremist excuses meander from pseudo-reasonable worries about the alleged exorbitant cost of removal to their shamelessness of pride over a meaningless, fair skin complexion and a familial heritage whose history is marred by needless and often unspoken murders. Whether or not something is historical is not a good enough excuse to maintain a symbol to a person, event, or anything else that conflicts with the values of the nation, whose pledge is one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. If a countless number of people, which include men, women, and children, can be murdered with no repercussions to the violent, merciless perpetrators, then this nation is not what we were brought up to believe it was. We can't change history, and tearing down a statue does not change what America was, but it can transform what it means to be American today. There have been many monuments before now that have fallen in countries where the values of the people changed. The Berlin Wall could have stayed up, but it fell because what it represented clashed with the country's reunification. Just because something is historic, that doesn't mean that it deserves to be flaunted in some mock heroic way. Black Lives Matter. And if you need a discussion to append that, then fuck you. Well, I've got to hand it to you. Keeping you around was more useful than I thought it'd be.
Thank you, I'm honored. There's nowhere else I'd rather be.
We don't take kindly to liars around these parts.
What do you mean?
You know exactly what I mean.
Please, this isn't necessary. I'll be quiet.
Fare thee well, old chap. Thank you for watching ARSTPLAINED. Please like this video and subscribe. If you don't like anything that I've said, please also feel free to unsubscribe. I also want to thank our patrons on Patreon for their generosity. We at Downhill Media would also like to ask that you donate to the following funds and organizations: